Hi friends, I'm Chelsea Grayson coming to you once again from the Office of the CEO. This is my show where I can help you be more successful in your current career, and I can also help you successfully transition to a new career. Today we're continuing my multi-part series about transitioning to a new career when that new career is your own company. And I've been talking you through how to draft your business plan. And today we're going to talk about the section of the business plan where you go through the company history, the milestones that you've hit already. So this is looking backwards and bringing the company full circle from where you started to where you currently are. And even if you're a startup, even if you have formed relatively recently, every company has important historical milestones that a potential investor or a potential employee will want to know about so that they can get a full sense of where the company's been and an idea for where the company's headed in the future. So I usually like to include the company's history or its historical milestone section either at the end of the executive summary or just at the beginning of the big section that comes after the executive summary, which goes to a description of the company itself along with its products and services. And you can make your own decision about where you want to include it. So for sure, you're going to want to include in this section the things that may seem relatively mundane. When was the company formed? This is actually very important, in particular for investors, so that they know that this isn't just a so-called DBA, which stands for doing business as. So you haven't just reserved a name for the company, you've actually formed the company. Whether that company has been formed as a corporation, as an LLC, as a sole proprietorship, one way or the other, potential investors in particular or lenders will want to know when was this company formed and what type of corporate entity is this. I also like to include a little bit of a personal touch, right? So you're the founder, you're drafting this business plan, and I like to include the eureka moment. This is when I knew that I wanted to form this company and operate this particular business. This is when I realized that there was a niche, that there was something that wasn't being provided in the marketplace that I should provide. This is when I realized the world, or whatever your target population is, needed this particular product or this service, and that I could provide this to them, right? So a lot of times this is tinged with, I had a gap in my life, there was something that I needed, there was a service or a product that I needed, nobody out there could provide it for me, or I tried various services or products and they were subpar, so I figured out that I could fill this niche and I could fill it better than anybody else is currently filling it. So, people like that because it sort of feeds into a section that comes up a little bit later, which is the competitive analysis. Why is this needed, and how are your competitors doing in terms of providing this? But it also, like I say, it provides a nice personal touch, and it's something for people to relate to. It's part of the story. And I think you guys have heard me say before that the most important part of your business plan is telling a cohesive, interesting personal story for people to follow. So this isn't just yet another boring business plan about yet another thing that I probably don't really need. So for sure, talk about when did you get the idea to operate this business. I think it's also really important to talk about if there's any intellectual property, even if this just comes down to a logo for the company, talk about that intellectual property, and most importantly, talk about, did you get protection for that intellectual property? Have you filed for a patent? Have you filed for trademark protection? What is the status of that application? Is it pending? Did it get approved? Do you have others in the pipeline? Have there been challenges? Have you yourself sent any cease and desist letters to other companies that you feel have infringed on your intellectual property? That can be particularly interesting to folks because they see that you like to really guard the value of your intellectual property, and they see that potentially it's valuable enough that people are already trying to steal it or trying to copy you, and it just gives them a sense for how valuable your IP is and how hard you're willing to go to bat to protect the IP. Also, just as interesting to investors, is there a potential second revenue stream here in getting a licensing royalty from folks who have violated your intellectual property rights, right? Like, so somebody who has infringed upon your IP rights, can you get retroactive royalty stream from them? Or can you, going forward, license this intellectual property to other folks to the extent it doesn't damage your own business and get a nice continuing annuity in the form of a licensing royalty from that licensing agreement, right? So that can be really interesting for folks to hear about what's the history of your intellectual property. Other things that people like to hear about in the milestone section, the company history section, is when did you make certain really important, significant hires? How did you get that person? How did that person do? Have you promoted them from within? Have you given them additional responsibility that can show that they've done even better than you thought they were going to? Have you added to the staff? People like to see how your employee population started out and how has it grown and evolved over time, right? So they like to see that as part of the growth trajectory and how they can predict growth, including, rightly so, payroll cost moving forward. So another thing that I like to mention in the company milestone section are, what sorts of strategic alliances or partnerships have I formed as part of the company's history? So what sorts of folks am I partnered up with that I'm going to be able to, what partnerships can I leverage moving forward? And what sorts of partnerships am I even, indebted to, for example, moving forward? Who am I going to owe a favor to that did a favor for me in the past on this, on my milestone chart? So that can be really interesting for folks to understand, because this is the first time they're probably going to be seeing anything about those strategic alliances and partnerships. So it plants the seed for them to look for a bigger, more robust explanation of those alliances moving forward in the business plan. So it's kind of a nice teaser to get them to continue to read so they can continue to hear about that partnership and what it's going to afford for the company moving forward. So another thing that's interesting for folks to read about in the company milestone section are, when did I take my first investors? What were the collective amounts of those first investments? How have I spent those investments? What are some other investors I took in after that? They just like to sort of see a history of that. Now, you definitely will get to that later on in a more robust way in the business plan, because you'll show what's called a cap table, which shows all of the investors so far in the company and exactly what percentage of the company each of those investors owns. But it can be really interesting for folks to see it laid out in linear form as well, right? So not just a cap table to show who owns the company collectively, but also when did each of these investors come along? How much did they invest in? Did they come along again and put more into the company? So those are really interesting rhythms and patterns that outside investors and also important strategic potential hires really like to see, so they can see how you're developing, how you're attracting attention, and how you're getting people to come back as repeat investors. So the last thing that I'll talk about in this section, and certainly you can put any sort of important milestone that you choose to in this section, and feel free to DM me with questions if I haven't gone over a particular topic here. But the last thing that you for sure want to include is milestones in respect of R&D, research and development, in respect of your products and your services. So R&D, when did you conceive of something? When did you hit milestones along the way in terms of creating that product or service? When did you launch each of your products or services, and how has that gone? A soft launch, then a hard launch, then you introduced version 2 of that product, for example, and so on and so forth. Again, you're going to go into this a lot more in other sections in the business plan, but this can be a really interesting way for people to see it laid out, again, on a timeline, and they can see the evolution from research to development to soft launch to hard launch to versions 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however it goes. So that's a very basic conversation about what ought to go into your company history or milestone section in your business plan. I'd love to hear your comments or questions about this episode, so please go ahead and drop it in the comments or feel free to DM me, and I will see you next time from the Office of the CEO.